So, who's concerned for the spiritual life of the returnists? My series of sense-making, as I've come to call them, postings, began when I observed proceedings on the floor of Synod CRCNA 2023 and witnessed the distress of many, but not most, as the vice-grippian relentlessness of an agenda intent on returning to a certain view of church was being implemented. There is probably a majority of people in the pew who are okay with or in support of the actual decisions being made on paper. I don't argue those decisions myself. But what disturbed underneath was how it was happening and being accomplished. The forceful, lurching, wrenching cultural shift it represented. I heard people try to articulate their disturbance with statements like, "This is getting punitive," and "Don't be jerks about it." And the question that was raised, if my children and grandchildren aren't so sure about some of these things, will they still be welcome in the CRC? Do you hear the connection and relational and historic piece in that question? I believe if people understand the dangers to the gospel of the worldview behind this cultural shift, more would begin speaking out. As I created these 20-something postings since Synod, I began over time to see it more and more clearly. So today I'm laying it out as I see it, bluntly. I think you need to have consumed all the other videos. I don't make money if you watch them, so I'm not trying to make money on this. But I think you do need to have followed all the other videos to understand what I'm saying today. The distress that I saw was felt and expressed by a group that I believe to be a subculture of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. That group, that culture, had, up to the last two synods, been the ascending stream of CRCNA culture. I think of that subculture as relationally oriented and narrative connection oriented. The culture those people were trying to work with and communicate with and express their distress to is a subculture typified by emphasis on rules, regulations, propositional statements, and doctrine, of course. These two groups are, I believe, on a continuum. Or is it actually a loop? Because sometimes the people on the what would be called left end of the scale start to sound just as fierce as those on the right. But it's at least a continuum, at least to help understand it. The majority of CRC people are somewhere in the middle of the two ends. The narrative-oriented relationalists were trying to communicate relationship, connection, and shared story in an environment, meaning the floor of Synod and its process, that favors rule-driven subculture. Rule-driven process itself is itself, in fact, a product of that kind of culture and of that culture's primacy in our history, even our Reformed history, but in world history as well. The age of reason, it's sometimes referred to. Scholasticism is another tag to put on it. Rule of law, tough good guys, and so forth, are all part of that culture. It also seems to be a primacy that this group wants to reinstate, to return to, which is why I refer to them in shorthand as returnists, trying to create a new label that just captures it. They call my kind revisionists, starting with the HSR, the Human Sexuality Report, which I am. I am a revisionist. And my life has been re-envisioned once I came to understand what the gospel's all about. I used to live, well, I wasn't a returnist, so I guess I can't claim that, but I used to live in a much more black and white cultural view of what Christianity represented. Again, that's in some of the videos. Articulating the worldview of what I call the relationals has become, without my setting out to find that, one of the goals of this series of videos. Because I started to realize that the center and some of the left, the progressives as they're generally referred to, were operating on certain assumptions that they didn't seem to have articulated. We can point to authors that have shaped it in us, maybe Philip Yancey, maybe Eugene Peterson, and a few others, that have shaped those assumptions that we now operate on. But we don't have, that I know of, a brief articulation of what it actually is. And so I recognized that as I was making these videos. I've meandered a lot in this exploratory journey to get to the point of today. And after today, I plan, or I intend, to take a break from doing this. But I want to tell you that the relational worldview, as I'm trying to describe it, biblically and just experientially, has over my lifetime in the CRC, born and raised in the CRC, son of a conservative CRC pastor, has become my own. That worldview starts and hangs from a belief that God is all about relationship. First and foremost, number one, above all others. All else, everything else, is lesser, including obedience and law. They come lower down the hierarchy, you could say, than relationship. It comes first in God's view and in our understanding. I believe I've demonstrated that from various places in Scripture, in my postings, and I lean heavily on the Rabbi Jesus' parable of the prodigal father. In that particular string of comparables, he is responding, never forget, to law-oriented religious leaders who were upset at Jesus' lack of chastity, spiritual chastity, even physical chastity, in his associating with, yea, even eating with, known sinners. The obedient son in the parable represents them. And Jesus does this very intentionally and very wisely and very shrewdly. And Jesus leaves them out of the kingdom celebration due to their willfulness and hurt feelings that there was no price to pay for breaking law, custom, and even relationship. They couldn't fathom that. The Pharisees and teachers of the law couldn't, and that particular son couldn't. I hear a similar emphasis in the leaders of this shift movement, this returnist movement at Synod. I do. And it greatly troubles me to see this and to hear this and to recognize it and to see it continuing in public postings that are made by some of its representatives. And since I know that group to be biblically serious, it should trouble them and cause deep reflection, not attack, not defensive attack, but deep reflection to hear someone name the similarity. Take time to think about that before you do any kind of reacting. The emphasis on law, rules, strict obedience, enforced compliance, and enforced chastity is actually a 10-alarm spiritual fire. And it needs some healthy Reformed theologians to put it out. Along the way in the videos I explored and shared, I showed how I believe Jesus was relationally and narratively oriented. So we have a good example in that. And certainly he was that, more so than any kind of law orientation. If he did anything, he defied the law orientation. This binary thinking about should we pay taxes or not. That kind of black or white thinking. And he reserved, Jesus did, his strongest critiques for those who had taken rule-based living and woven it into an oppressive and burden-loading, which he says himself, religious system we refer to today in shorthand as the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They had a lot of things right. Do hear me saying that. But they took some things to an extreme that Jesus very blatantly challenged, sometimes directly, sometimes in parables. I firmly assert that I see the movement that is driving the returnist agenda of the past 2 years as being in the same kind of error in understanding the gospel, in understanding what Jesus was there to do and to teach and to demonstrate, that the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were when Jesus walked this earth. It's taken me all these weeks to get to a place where I can say it bluntly with conviction. My own relational connection worldview, the one I saw struggling to express itself in the tide of returnist strategic actions, takes God's word and work seriously as well. But not as a legal document. We hear the word in terms of an overarching restorative narrative into which we are invited to have our own stories woven. Our stories include episodes of younger sonness and older sonness. Our stories include, for some, Damascus Road encounters with undeserved grace and a sudden deep awareness of a God Father who paid a huge price himself to open the way back to relationship for us, for you, for all. Our stories often include times when we believed we had to keep chaste and keep law and avoid spotten in order, apologies for a Dutch word, in order to keep our seat in heaven. And then in a twist to the story, the shocking realization as part of our stories that that's not what the triune God is all about. Again, my video on God coming closer and putting rules in place so that His holiness would not kill an unholy people was that turning point in my story. And so we realize, with dread, that the serpent has twisted the story we believed and sub-convinced us law-keeping was the way in. And the wonderful part of our story when we realized how false that was. And we began to put the forbidden fruit further from us. And the surprise, when people started noticing the fruit of the Spirit evidencing itself in our lives in its place, without real strong effort on our part, something else was at work. What a privilege! What a joy divine! What a freedom! But it's a hard to comprehend freedom if you're trapped in law, as Paul points out. So, returnists, join that story. Let go of being a gathering of Sauls, proudly convinced you are serving God, guarding the cloaks stone throwers have left in your care, as the legally unchaste are castigated. Let it go. Find the real gospel. What I worry about, for your sake, is that you, like the expert in the law that was so eager to learn exactly what he, this is important, must do, you are not yet fully aware, like him, of how truly helpless you are before the law to keep the law. It's impossible. You do not see how you are in fact, in the parables Jesus told in response, the man who is out cold at the side of the road, knocked out, knocking himself out by trying to figure out the law exactly, so that when his time came for a final accounting with the Godhead, you thought, or he thought, you would be able to say, I kept the law. I figured it out. I worked hard all these years for you to earn my inheritance. And I expect a place. And then, as you say that, expect a place to be reserved for you. When the law becomes, in our stories, strong guideposts that warn us when we are moving out of the relational possibilities God himself restored, we have opportunity to check our hearts, to recognize we are destroying something we profess to be the most important thing, our worshipful relationship to God. And in those moments when we recognize that, we actually find a new freedom. We actually find our hearts changing. We find a new spirit motivating us and guiding us if we remain connected and determined to not wander. When we enter God's story in that way, when we have our story woven into his redemption story, we find our desires to be shifting to gathering around the well of living water instead of putting up fences to keep those who we don't think should drink out. And we find ourselves inviting others to come join us and drink from it as well, no matter what their station in life. We invite them to join us at the banquet table, like Jesus was joining the sinners at table. And if my thinking and theology on this is on target, sinners, maybe even people involved in same-sex sexual activity, that horrifying thing, will be changed from drinking from the well with us. might be changed over time and might recognize what part of their life's activities and beliefs is hindering relationship with God through Jesus and the Spirit. But there are enough people concerned about them. I'm concerned most for those who present as certain, decisive leaders today, who are in actuality acting like an older brother, meting out consequences to those who, in their rule-oriented, earning heaven worldview, are falling short. I issue a call to them to return to the full gospel and its reformed expression. If you're going to return to something, return to that. So, who is concerned for the spiritual life of the returnists? I am. And if you are as well, voice your concerns. Not about the decisions made, although other people can continue to spend time on that, but the worldview driving it that is not consistent with the call of a God who wants relationship with you and with as many as will return to him.